everybody. Welcome to Life Point. We're excited that you're able to join us for this. This week, we took on our second week of Route 66 and the passage of James in chapter 1, where he talks about temptation. You see, last week we talked about trials and tribulations. And then James goes right from talking about hardships and trials and tribulations that we're all going to face to something else that we're all going to face, which is temptation. The first thing that James talks about is, hey, listen up, it is not God that's tempting you. God doesn't tempt us. See, he's coming in from talking about these trials. First point he makes on temptation is it's not coming from God. We all have a tendency to struggle more when we're going through a hard time. It's easier to steal. It's easier to lie. It's easier to give in to all kinds of stuff when we're in the middle of a hard time. And he's saying, listen, even though God lets us go through hard times, even though God uses those hard times to develop us, God's not setting you up to fail. God's not setting you up with temptation in those times. That's coming from somewhere else. And that's exactly where he goes next, is where are our temptations coming from? And that's the meat of what we're going to talk about right now. Now, James uses an analogy here of being lured in. Now, he doesn't say that Satan comes in and puts temptation in our hearts. He doesn't say that God comes and puts temptations in our hearts. He says that rather we're enticed by our own desires. Now, this is huge because so many people like to blame everything on Satan or on somebody else. But James is saying, listen, it's coming from inside of us. It's coming from our own desires that we're tempted. And then he talks about how temptation, when it's fully conceived, in other words, when we allow it to fully develop, it brings it brings forth sin. He said, temptation, when fully conceived, gives birth to sin. You see, in our lives, we all deal with temptation. But if we don't deal with the temptation right then and there, and we let it fester, sin comes from that. And then sin, when fully developed, gives birth to death. You see a 3-step process here. We're tempted. Sin happens. Then death happens. 3 things. Now, it's important that we look at what's the root here. He says it's our desires, that lead to temptation. Now, we need to kill temptation at its source so it doesn't give birth to sin. And you know what? We're all human. We're all going to mess up. We're all going to sin at some time. So when that does happen, we need to kill the sin right then and there. Not let the sin develop, not let the sin become something bigger. We need to take care of it right then and there. Now, so many people, though, the problem is we like our sin. Does sin bring pleasure? Yes, it brings pleasure very often. You know, everybody who's gotten in an affair, they did it for the pleasure. Everybody who has told something false, they did it to cover something up, to feel better about themselves. Anybody who struggled with an eating problem, most of the time there's pleasure involved, A lot of times we like our sin. But the problem is if we let that sin develop, if we don't deal with it in our lives, it brings forth death. Now, James isn't just talking about spiritual death here. There are a lot of sins that develop can lead to physical death. Our alcohol and drug problems can lead to that. All kinds of things can lead to physical death. But James is more specifically here talking about spiritual death or separation from God. And that's a very scary thing. So that's a bad thing we want to look at. We don't want to let temptation lead later on to separation from God. Not at all what we want. So if we want to keep from going from here to here, how do we deal with the problem here? By looking at our desires. See, the thing is, Satan uses both good and bad desires to tempt us. Everybody likes to eat. It's a good thing. Everybody has ambition. It's a good thing. But Satan will take those good things and entice us, turn them evil within us to do something bad. How many people have lied on a job application because they wanted a job? Is that ambitious wanting that job good? Yes, the ambition's good, but out of that good desire, something bad came. We have evil desires within us too. James was talking specifically about these evil desires. Lust is one that many people deal with. You know what? That desire lays within us, and Satan takes that desire and expounds upon it. We've got to make sure our desires are aligning with God's desires. Yes, we can look at what the consequence is, and that's powerful, and we should. So when we're about to do something wrong, we're entertaining temptation, we should look at what the end result is. But more importantly, we need to look at what's in our hearts. Just like King David prayed in the Psalms, God, make the desires of your heart my desires. That needs to be our prayer. But we also need to understand that we can truly put our faith and our trust in God. Because at some fundamental place in our hearts, we don't really understand how loving God really is, how much He really loves us. And we need to be able to trust Him and align our desires with that God really does care for us. You know, if you're struggling with eating, does God really want me to take care of my body because He loves me? If you're struggling with lust or other sexual temptation, do you really believe that God's plan for sexuality works? Or do you believe that you have to do what you feel like you want to do to be fulfilled sexually? What about God's provision in your life? Do you trust that you can get the fulfillment and the things you need in life from God, or do we got to do it our own way? There's a trust issue within us and God. If we can deal with that trust issue and trust that God is who He says He is, and that we can trust that God really is our provider, and that we can trust that God really cares for us and wants us to be the best and who He's called us to be, we can start changing the desires of our heart and aligning it more with His heart. So tonight, I'm not going to list out a bunch of questions. We're going to stop and pause the video, but there's 3 things I want you to talk about in your group. One is, what's some temptation that you struggled with in the past, and how did you overcome it? You know, I know some people have dealt with a lot stronger things than others. If you're comfortable sharing about those things, please do, because somebody may be struggling with it right now that they're not willing to open up, and your story about how you overcame can help someone. Secondly, if you're comfortable doing so, talk about some of the stuff that may be tempting you right now. If you're struggling with whatever it may be, talk about what that is. People want to encourage you. They want to pray for you. They want to help you to overcome that. And that goes right into our third thing. Discuss how you can help one another defeat temptation. There's a lot of power within the body of Christ when we work together, when we're open with one another, when we hold each other accountable. How can you help your group that you're with tonight overcome temptation, regardless of what it is, whether it's something that seems small or whether it seems something that's life-altering? How can you help those in your group to overcome the temptation when it comes into their life? Thanks for joining us, and we'll look forward to seeing you next week.